I used to think bonus season was the one part of corporate life that stayed fair, even when everything else didn't. I'm not an executive. I'm not a founder's friend. I'm the guy who lives in the middle. Compensation operations. The person who makes sure salary changes don't get entered twice. That approvals match policy. That payroll doesn't explode because someone decided rules were optional. It's not glamorous work. It's spreadsheets, systems, and the quiet kind of responsibility where you only get noticed when something goes wrong. But last winter, something went wrong on purpose. The company I work for isn't small. We're big enough to have a board, big enough to have auditors crawling through our processes every quarter, big enough that every people decision gets dressed up as strategy. We'd had a strong year on paper. Revenue was up. Churn was down. My team had been working nights because the bonus pool is never just a number. It's a chain of decisions, forecasts, accruals, approvals, corrections, and people were counting on it. In a real-life way. Rent, daycare, debt. Whatever their version was, that check mattered. 2 weeks before the holiday break, the calendar invite hit. All hands. Mandatory. Title: Year-End Update. That's when everyone starts doing the math in their heads. The auditorium was cold, the kind of cold that makes people keep their coats on. The stage lights were bright enough to hide faces. The CEO sat in the front row with his usual calm posture, hands folded, looking like a man who could say anything and still sound reasonable. And next to him was his daughter. She wasn't officially called the CEO's daughter at work. On org charts, she had a title that sounded earned. Something like Head of Strategic Initiatives. In meetings, people treated her like a verdict. She walked up to the microphone like she owned the room. "We need to tighten belts," she said, smiling, "so we can invest in growth." That phrase, tighten belts, sounds responsible. It also makes you feel selfish for caring about your own paycheck. Then she said it. No discretionary bonuses this quarter. No one booed. No one stood up. People did what they always do when their bills are on the line. They went quiet. A few managers clapped softly, like applause could make it less real. My phone buzzed. A message from my manager. "Keep a neutral face." I stared at that sentence and felt something in my chest tighten. Not anger yet. Something worse. Recognition. Because I knew what no discretionary bonuses actually meant. It meant months of work erased with a single slide. It meant people who stayed late because they believed leadership would take care of us, would be told it was for the mission. It meant the same executives who preached ownership would call it temporary sacrifice and move on. And the CEO didn't say a word. He just sat there, hands folded, letting her deliver the blow like it was a leadership exercise. When the meeting ended, the room emptied in polite silence. You could hear chairs scrape and forced laughter in the hallway, the sound people make when they're trying to prove they're still employed. I walked back to my desk without speaking to anyone. My job, whether I liked it or not, was to make sure the system reflected what leadership just announced. Bonus pool, set to 0. Payout files, canceled. Approvals, archived. I logged into the HR system and opened my queue, and there it was. A pending compensation action with her name on it. At first, I thought it was a mistake, maybe an old draft someone forgot to delete. That happens. People create changes, abandon them, and the system still routes them for review. So I clicked it, ready to reject it with a clean note. Then I saw the amount. A base salary increase worth $95,000. Not a bonus, not a one-time award, a permanent adjustment. My mouse didn't move for a full minute. In my world, salary actions aren't supposed to be emotional. They're supposed to be boring. There's a policy for everything. How raises are justified. What documentation must be attached. Which leaders can approve which thresholds. This request had documentation, technically. A one-page alignment memo full of vague words. Retention. Benchmark. Continuity. No real data. Just language. Under effective date. It said the same morning as the all hands. I looked up from my screen and watched my coworkers walking past my desk, still processing the speech, still texting spouses and doing mental math. None of them knew this existed. None of them could know, because the file was restricted. My role gave me access, the kind you don't brag about because it comes with a quiet rule. You see things you can't unsee. My throat went dry. I clicked into the approval chain. 3 names were already signed off, and the last approver wasn't HR. It was the CEO. Then I noticed something small, buried in a drop-down most people never touch: a cost center override. Normally, salary increases flow through standard departmental budgets. This one was coded to a corporate bucket, labeled discretionary leadership allocation. The same bucket my team had been told was now too tight for bonuses. That's when the story stopped being insulting and became measurable. For a second, I almost did something reckless. I almost forwarded it somewhere. I almost took a picture of the screen. But I've seen people get fired for mishandling confidential data when what they really did was make leadership uncomfortable. So I did the thing my job trained me to do. I documented like a professional. I wrote down the transaction ID in a notebook that never leaves my bag. I noted the timestamps. I opened the audit trail tab and read it line by line. Who created it? Who edited it? What fields changed and when? The request had been created less than an hour after the bonus meeting. Invite went out, and the initiator wasn't her. It was her executive assistant. That detail hit me harder than the number, because it meant this wasn't spontaneous. It was scheduled, prepared, delegated. I sat back in my chair and listened to the office noise around me. The printers, the Slack pings, the holiday playlists someone insisted on looping. That was the moment I realized the belts weren't being tightened. They were being rerouted, and I was holding the receipt, whether I wanted to be or not. So before I said a word to anyone, I opened the standard variance report we run before every payroll. Not a leak, not a stunt, just a routine control check. And her line item was already sitting there, waiting to go live. I didn't sleep much that night, not because I was shocked, because I kept replaying how clean they'd tried to make it look. In the morning, I did what I always do when something feels off. I removed myself from it emotionally and treated it like a controls problem. First, I pulled the policy library and searched for the exception language referenced in the memo. The memo claimed it was within the discretionary leadership allocation framework. That sounded official. It also sounded like something someone made up because it could sound official. There was no framework. There was a discretionary bucket, sure. There were guidelines around it. But there was nothing that allowed a permanent base adjustment of that size without comp committee review and a documented market analysis. At minimum, it required a benchmark attachment. At minimum, it required HR to own the justification. This didn't have any of that. It had words. Then I checked our normal workflow thresholds. Past a certain amount, the system is supposed to route to total rewards leadership. Past a higher amount, it's supposed to route to the compensation committee liaison. That routing is automated. That's the whole point. Her request had bypassed it, not by hacking anything, by using the one loophole that exists in almost every company, a manual override field that only a handful of roles can touch. My first thought was, who else has access to do that? The audit trail already told me. It was initiated by her assistant, but the assistant shouldn't have been able to override routing. That permission sits with HR operations, my area. So either someone in my function helped, or someone had been granted access they shouldn't have. And that was just the beginning. I opened the access roster and ran a quick roll report. Again, normal work, we do it regularly. Who has what permissions, who was added, who was removed. One name jumped out, a new HR systems analyst, hired 2 months ago, listed as a contractor. Their permission set was absurdly high for a contractor. Enough to adjust workflow rules, enough to touch compensation routing. I recognized the name because I'd seen them once, hovering near the CEO's daughter after a meeting, carrying a laptop like a bodyguard carries a bag. I copied the roster output into a secure internal ticket and tagged it as an access anomaly review. That way, it wasn't me accusing anyone, it was a process. Then I did the next routine step. I ran the payroll variance report again and compared it to the previous week's accrual schedule. That's when the irritation stopped being abstract and turned into something physical. The same discretionary corporate bucket funding her raise had been used the previous quarter to top up retention bonuses for critical teams, engineering, client success, and a few roles that were hard to replace. The bucket had been drained, and now, right after Titan belts, a permanent $95,000 increase was queued to land. A neat little transfer of pain. I didn't need to guess motives. I could see the path. Still, you can't walk into a manager's office and say, "The CEO's daughter stole our bonuses," unless you want to be walked out by security. So I did it the correct way. I wrote a formal clarification request inside the HR system, attached the policy citation, and asked for the market benchmark documentation that was missing. Neutral language, no accusations. Just, please provide support for the adjustment in accordance with compensation policy. Then I sent my manager a short message. I flagged a routing CHM policy mismatch on a senior compensation action. I've requested documentation per standard. He replied within minutes. Do not touch that. 3 words, no greeting, no explanation. I stared at my screen and felt my face get hot. Because do not touch that isn't how managers talk about policy. It's how they talk about landmines. I didn't argue in writing. I walked to his office. He didn't invite me in. He stepped into the hall and pulled the door almost closed behind him, like the walls could listen. You're overthinking it, he said. It's executive comp. It's not executive comp, I said, keeping my voice low. It's routed through our system as a standard salary action, with a manual override, with missing attachments. His jaw tightened. You want to keep your job? There it was, the real policy. I want to keep my integrity, I said, then immediately hated how dramatic it sounded. So I corrected myself. I want to keep the company out of an audit issue. He looked past me, down the corridor, checking who might be watching. Then he leaned closer. This is coming from above, he said. The CEO signed it. That should tell you everything. It did, just not what he thought. Because if the CEO was signing off on something that bypassed controls, then either the CEO didn't know what he was approving, or he did, and he believed nobody would challenge it. And if nobody challenged it, it wouldn't be a scandal. It would be precedent. I went back to my desk and did something I rarely do. I opened the Ethics and Compliance portal, not to file a dramatic complaint, to ask a narrow question. I wrote, compensation workflow, routing override used on senior salary action, missing required documentation, confirm whether this aligns with policy and governance. No names, no emotions, just controls language. Then I saved the case number. A few hours later, the system sent an automated notification. The documentation request I'd entered had been removed. Not denied. Removed, like it never existed. I refreshed my screen twice, thinking it was a glitch. Then I saw a new note on the compensation action. Handled offline. That's the phrase people use when they don't want a trail. My hands went cold again, but this time I wasn't frozen. I was angry. So I did the one thing they couldn't erase without making it worse. I pulled the standard audit log export. It's a built-in function used for internal reviews. It creates a time-stamped record of edits, routing changes, and who performed them. I exported it to the compliance case file attachment slot. The portal locks attachments once uploaded. Not even I can delete them after submission. When it finished uploading, I felt a small, sharp relief. The first micro-victory of the whole mess. Then my calendar popped. A meeting invite for the next morning. Title, alignment. Attendees, me, my manager, HR business partner, and someone from legal I'd never met. No agenda, no description. Just a room name and a time. I sat there staring at the invite, because I understood what they were doing. They weren't going to debate the raise. They were going to decide what to do about the person who noticed it. And the worst part was, I still hadn't told a single coworker what I'd seen. Because the only thing more dangerous than being right in a corporation is being right alone. The next morning, I dressed like I always do when something feels off. Nothing flashy, nothing careless. Neutral colors, clean shoes, the kind of outfit that says, I belong here, even if the building is trying to disagree. I got to the office early, mostly to calm my head down, partly because I wanted to see if my access still worked. It did, for the moment. I sat at my desk and pulled up the compliance case I'd opened. The audit log attachment was still there, locked. That mattered. It meant there was now an independent record of what happened, created by a system outside my manager's control. And I'm going to be honest, I felt a tiny flicker of confidence. Not because I thought I'd win, because I knew I wasn't crazy. Then my manager messaged me, "Come to the room now, don't bring your laptop." That was the first time my stomach truly dropped. Companies love procedure until procedure protects the wrong person. Then they want you unarmed. No documents, no timestamps, no ability to quote anything. I walked to the meeting room and found them already seated. My manager, our HR business partner, and a man in a charcoal suit who didn't introduce himself until HR did it for him. "This is Martin," she said, like I was being introduced to a new coworker. "He supports legal." Supports, not from, not representing. Supports. That choice of word told me exactly what this was. Not a conversation, a containment meeting. They didn't offer water. They didn't ask how I was doing. HR smiled in a way that had no warmth behind it. "We want to align on expectations," she began. I said nothing. I just waited. My manager slid a piece of paper across the table. It was a printed copy of our confidentiality policy, highlighted like a school assignment. "We've noticed unusual access patterns," he said, tapping the paper with his finger. "You've been looking at sensitive compensation data outside of your scope." That was the first lie. My scope is literally compensation data. But I understood what they were trying to do. Make my attention the problem, not what I saw. "I accessed a compensation action routed to my queue," I said, keeping my voice calm. "That is my scope." "Martin, the legal support, lean slightly forward. The concern is what you did with the information." "I asked for the required documentation," I said, and I opened a compliance case when the documentation request was removed. HR's smile tightened. "And why did you think that was necessary?" "Because you drained everyone's bonuses to pay for a raise you couldn't justify." But I didn't say that. "Because a routing override was used," I said, "and required attachments were missing. That's a governance issue." There was a brief silence, the kind that's less about processing and more about recalculating. Then my manager said, "Executive compensation is handled differently." "If that's true," I said, "then it shouldn't have been processed through the standard system with a manual override that bypassed controls." Martin watched me like I was a risk assessment. "Were you instructed not to touch it?" he asked. I held his gaze. "Yes, and you did anyway." "I followed policy," I said. "That is my job." HR finally dropped the smile. "This isn't a debate. We're here because you escalated prematurely and created unnecessary exposure." There it was, the real accusation. Not that I was wrong, that I made it visible. My manager slid another document across the table. This one wasn't policy. It was a performance memo. It listed vague issues: communication style, judgment, ability to collaborate with leadership, the kind of language that can justify anything if you say it slowly enough. I read it once, then looked up. "This is dated today," I said. HR nodded. "We're addressing it now." "How convenient," I said before I could stop myself. Martin's eyebrows lifted a fraction. "Let's keep it professional." I swallowed my irritation and forced my voice back into neutral. "Professional would be documenting the justification for a compensation action that contradicts the company's public message," I said. Professional would be ensuring routing controls aren't being bypassed by a contractor with elevated permissions. The HR partner's eyes flickered at the word contract. That detail bothered her. How do you know about a contractor's permissions? She asked. Because I ran the access roster like a normal controls check. But I heard the trap in her tone. They wanted to frame routine work as snooping. I reviewed access roles as part of my function, I said. It's a standard audit step when an override appears. My manager exhaled sharply. You're not an auditor. No, I agreed, which is why I used the compliance portal. That was the moment Martin's face changed. Not visibly, not dramatically. Just the smallest shift, like he'd heard a piece of information he wasn't expecting. Which portal case? He asked. I didn't give him the number, not out loud, not in a room where everything could be reinterpreted. I created a case, I said. It contains the audit log export. HR's voice went flat. You attached confidential compensation details. I attached the system audit trail, I said. It's metadata. Edits, routing changes, timestamps, not a gossip file. Martin looked at HR for a half second, and for the first time since I walked in, I felt the balance shift slightly. Because if there was a locked compliance attachment, that meant someone outside this room could see it. It meant legal couldn't just bury the story by burying me. That didn't mean I was safe. It meant they had to be careful. HR cleared her throat. Regardless, we're concerned about your judgment. We think it's best if you take administrative leave while we review. Administrative leave. That corporate phrase that sounds gentle and feels like a trap door. Is this related to my performance? I asked. Or is this related to the compensation action I flagged? It's related to trust, my manager said quickly. Trust. Another word they use when they can't say the real one. Obedience. I nodded slowly. If I'm being placed on leave, I want it in writing. With the stated reason? HR's eyes narrowed. We'll send the documentation. And I want confirmation, I added, that my compliance case remains open and unaltered. Martin didn't answer directly. He just said, we'll handle the appropriate governance steps. That's when I realized something else, something that made my chest feel tight in a different way. They weren't sure how far this went. If they were confident it was clean, they would have terminated me right there and labeled it a misconduct issue. They would have made me the cautionary tale. Instead, they were pausing. Because a locked audit trail plus a governance violation is the kind of thing that turns into a board question, and board questions don't care whose daughter you are. They ended the meeting quickly after that. HR walked me back to my desk like I was a visitor. My manager stood behind me while I gathered my coat. Leave your badge, HR said, still calm, still polite. I placed it on the desk. As I walked out, I glanced at my phone and saw 3 missed calls. From an unknown internal extension, then a text from my manager. Don't talk to anyone. Let this go. I stopped in the lobby and stared at that message, because the truth is I hadn't talked to anyone. I hadn't warned teams. I hadn't posted anything. I hadn't tried to embarrass anybody. All I did was refuse to pretend I didn't see what I saw. And now I was on leave, without access, without a desk, without my badge, while that $95,000 raise sat in a queue, waiting to be finalized. I walked to my car and sat there for a full minute, hands on the steering wheel, breathing shallow. Then a notification came through from the compliance portal. Case assigned, internal audit. My heart didn't leap. It steadied, because internal audit doesn't get assigned unless someone with authority flags it as credible. And suddenly, the story stopped being about me and my job. It became about what happens when a company tells hundreds of people to sacrifice, while one person quietly pays herself first. And then silence, the kind that means something's gone wrong. The first day of administrative leave is supposed to feel like a break. It didn't. It felt like being erased while the building kept breathing without you. My laptop was disabled. My badge was dead. Even my work phone stopped syncing email. The message was clear. You don't have access. You don't exist. And if you try to prove otherwise, you'll be called unstable. But they forgot something about me. My entire job was built around systems that leave trails, and the compliance portal wasn't my system. It was the company's. That afternoon, I received a short email to my personal account, something HR usually avoids unless they have to. Administrative leave confirmed. Do not engage with employees regarding ongoing review. No details, no reason, no time frame. I forwarded it to myself and saved it with the case number. Then I did the only thing I could do without engaging. I watched. Over the next 2 days, I got small signals that the machine had started turning in a direction they didn't control. A former coworker from finance texted me, careful, like someone speaking near a sleeping animal. Are you okay? Audit asked for payroll variance extracts. I didn't respond with a story. I responded with one sentence. I'm fine. If they asked you, give them everything. He replied, they're asking weirdly specific questions. That made sense. Internal audit doesn't ask broad questions when they already have a trail. They ask to confirm a trail. On the third morning, another message came, this time from someone I hadn't spoken to in months, a senior analyst in total rewards. Did you open a compliance case? My throat tightened as I read it. I typed, deleted, typed again. Then I gave the safest answer. Yes. Keep it professional. Don't speculate. A pause. Then she wrote, they pulled the workflow logs. Someone changed routing rules last month. I sat there and stared at that line until my eyes hurt, because that was the piece my manager and HR had tried to crush in that room. The bypass wasn't an accident. It required access, intent, and planning. And now audit had found it without me having to convince anyone. That night, I realized I'd been holding my breath for days, and then it released. Just a little. Because if routing rules were altered, that's not a compensation disagreement. That's a controls violation, and controls violations don't stay inside HR. They climb. The next day, my manager called me for the first time since the meeting. He didn't start with anger, he started with friendliness. That shift told me more than any words could. Hey, he said, like we'd just chatted yesterday. How are you holding up? I'm fine, I said. A small pause, like he was choosing a mask. Listen, he began. This is getting bigger than it needs to be. Bigger than it needs to be. That's what people say when something is already too big to stop, he continued. Legal is looking at it. Audit is involved. The board is asking questions. It would really help if you could clarify that you didn't intend to suggest wrongdoing. I almost laughed. Almost. You mean you want me to say it was a misunderstanding? I said quietly. I want you to help de-escalate, he replied. For your sake. There was the threat wrapped in concern. I didn't escalate, I said. I followed policy. His voice tightened. You attached logs. I attached metadata, I corrected. The system's own record. Another pause. Then he changed direction. You know how these things go, he said. People get hurt. Careers get damaged. He wasn't talking about mine. I felt my anger rise, but I kept my tone even. My career is already damaged, I said. You did that when you told me not to touch it. He exhaled through his nose, annoyed I wasn't playing along. Then he said the part he'd been building toward. If you cooperate, we can probably bring you back. Different team. Fresh start. A demotion dressed as mercy. I stared at the wall in my apartment and felt something inside me harden. That night, I stopped being the hero. I wasn't going to rescue the same people who were trying to bury the trail. I'm willing to cooperate with internal audit, I said, in writing, through the case. He went quiet, and in that silence, I heard the truth. He didn't have authority anymore, because if he did, he'd be threatening me, not negotiating. The next morning, internal audit emailed me directly. Subject, request for interview compliance case. No theatrics, no moral lectures, just a list of questions and a time slot. The questions were surgical. When did I first observe the compensation action? What policy did I believe it contradicted? What steps did I take? Who instructed me to stop? What did I attach and why? I answered exactly. I didn't add drama. I didn't guess motives. I treated it like a timeline. During the interview, the auditor, calm mid-career, the type who's seen every trick, asked one question that made my skin prickle. Did you notice the cost center override? I didn't even hide it. Yes. He nodded slowly, like that confirmed something. Then he said, we've identified additional transactions routed through the same override path. Additional. Plural. That was the moment the story widened beyond the $95,000 raise. Not because she did one bold thing, because someone believed they could do it repeatedly. The auditor didn't tell me details. He didn't need to. He just said, we will follow up. After the call, I sat in my kitchen and stared at my coffee, like it was an object from another life. Then my phone rang again, unknown number. This time, it wasn't my manager. It was the HR business partner. Her voice had lost its polish. We need to schedule a conversation, she said quickly. About what? I asked. She hesitated, then forced the corporate tone back in. About your role and next steps. What changed? I asked. Another hesitation, and in that tiny delay, I heard what she didn't want to say. Power had shifted. We just want to align, she said. I almost smiled. Same word, different meaning now. I'll speak through audit, I replied. Her voice sharpened. You're making this harder. No, I said. I'm making it clean. Silence. Then she dropped the call. That afternoon, my former coworker from finance texted again. Emergency meeting. CEO and board liaison present. People are panicking. I read it twice, because that doesn't happen over a simple raise. That happens when audit walks into a room with a packet and says, explain this. And suddenly the CEO's daughter's speech about sacrifice wasn't just unethical. It was a liability. Then, late that night, I received a system notification from a place I still had access to, my personal alert subscriptions. It wasn't confidential content. It was the kind of automated ping you can set for workflow changes. Workflow rule updated, compensation routing thresholds. Updated back. The manual override path had been closed. That was my second micro victory, and it hit harder than the first. Because companies don't close a loophole unless someone important has finally acknowledged it existed. I sat there, phone in my hand, and realized something else. They weren't trying to silence me anymore. They were trying to contain what I'd already set in motion. And in corporate life, once internal audit moves, the next sound you hear is the board asking one question nobody wants to answer. Who approved it, and why? The next week moved in a way corporate life usually doesn't. Fast, quiet, surgical. I knew it was serious when I stopped getting pressure and started getting distance. My manager didn't call again. HR didn't check in. The tone shifted from intimidation to containment. And that only happens when the people who were confident yesterday are suddenly afraid of what's already written down. On Monday morning, internal audit sent me a short note through the case portal. Please confirm availability for a follow-up. Board-level review scheduled. Board level. That phrase is a ceiling you can't fake your way through. HR can threaten you. Managers can posture. But the board doesn't deal in vibes. They deal in risk, process, and documented approvals. The follow-up interview wasn't dramatic. It was structured. 2 auditors, both calm, both taking notes. Like this was routine, because for them it was. They asked me to walk through the timeline again, down to the hour. When the all-hands happened. When the compensation action appeared. When the documentation request was removed. When I was told not to touch it. When my access was cut. Then one of them asked a question that made my pulse spike. Did anyone explicitly connect the bonus decision to that discretionary cost center? I didn't guess. I didn't add a theory. No, I said. But the cost center funding the raise is the same bucket historically used to fund retention and discretionary payouts. And it was the bucket leadership referenced as constrained. The auditor nodded, not like he was impressed. like I'd just confirmed a control weakness he could now label without emotion. At the end, they asked me for something simple. We're going to request communications related to the change. If you have any written instruction you received, provide it. I did. I uploaded the message from my manager. Do not touch that. I uploaded the HR email placing me on leave with no reason stated. I uploaded my own documentation notes that I had already typed into the compliance case, neutral language, timestamps, transaction ID. When I clicked to submit, I felt my shoulders drop for the first time in weeks, because now the story wasn't mine to carry. It belonged to the record. 2 days later, I got a call from a number I recognized, the company's general counsel office. This time, the tone was different, not supportive, not threatening, controlled and careful, like they were walking on glass. "Thank you for your cooperation," the voice said. "We're concluding our review. You'll receive written guidance shortly." I waited. Then I asked the only question that mattered to me. "Am I still on leave because I followed policy?" A pause. "You were placed on leave to preserve the integrity of the review," they said. It was a lawyer's answer, not an apology, but not an accusation either. That afternoon, an email landed in my personal inbox, forwarded by HR because they still had my work email locked. Subject: return to work instructions. No fluff, just steps. My access would be restored the next morning. My leave would be reclassified as paid administrative leave with no disciplinary finding. I would report to a different leader, effective immediately. Different leader. My manager was gone. They didn't write that sentence, but they didn't have to. The next morning, I drove to the office early again, the way I did when this began, and sat in the parking lot, staring at the building like it was a stranger. I walked in, half expecting my badge to fail out of habit. It worked. The lobby looked exactly the same. Same plants, same security desk, same holiday decorations that hadn't been taken down yet. But the atmosphere was different. People weren't chatting. They were watching. You could feel it, that quiet panic that spreads when employees sense leadership has been caught doing something they can't explain. When I reached my floor, someone I barely knew from finance made eye contact and gave me the smallest nod. Not friendly, respectful. I sat down at my desk, logged in, and opened my inbox. There was a company-wide message from the CEO. Subject: governance update. It was written in that polished, careful style executives use when they want to admit something without sounding guilty. He said an internal review had identified process gaps in compensation governance. He said certain approvals would now require compensation committee oversight. He said workflow overrides were being restricted and access permissions audited. He said the company was committed to fairness and transparency. And then, near the bottom, the real line, the one everyone would read, twice. A discretionary recognition payment will be issued to eligible employees in the next payroll cycle. They didn't call it a bonus. They called it recognition. But everyone knew what it was. A partial return of what they tried to take. A correction disguised as generosity. I leaned back in my chair, not celebrating, just letting it settle. Then I opened the org chart. The CEO's daughter's name was still there, but her title was not. Her box had been moved to a special projects line that reported to someone else, not directly to the CEO. The kind of role you give someone when you need them out of the chain without humiliating the family. And my manager's box? Gone completely. Later that morning, my new leader, an older director from Total Rewards, asked me to step into a conference room. He didn't posture. He didn't threaten. He didn't pretend we were doing alignment. He just spoke like an adult. "I reviewed the case file," he said. "You did what you were supposed to do." I waited. Because in corporate life, praise is often the setup for a request. He slid a document across the table. It was a written statement, the company's conclusion. No misconduct on my part. Actions taken were within role scope. Administrative leave was precautionary only. No retaliation permitted. Any concerns to be routed directly to internal audit. It wasn't an apology, but it was protection. Then he said something that hit harder than the paper. They're changing the approval structure because of this. The board got involved. I nodded once, keeping my face neutral. Inside, something unclenched. Am I being moved? I asked. Yes, he said. Not as punishment, as insulation. You're being placed under my team. Your work will be reviewed at a higher level. You'll have less exposure to politics. Politics. That was his polite word for family power. I walked out of that room and went back to my desk. A message popped up from payroll. A preview of the upcoming recognition payment file for validation. I opened it, carefully, almost reverently. Names, amounts, departments, not huge for anyone, but real, enough to be felt, enough to say, we were forced to fix this. And then I saw something else, a reversal entry, a salary action rescinded, effective retroactive to its original date. No employee name visible in my view because access had been tightened overnight. But the transaction type told the story. They didn't just pause it, they undid it. That was my micro-catharsis, and it didn't feel like fireworks. It felt like gravity returning. By lunchtime, rumors were everywhere. But I didn't need rumors. I had official changes, official files, official reversals. Later that day, the HR business partner who had smiled at me like I was a problem asked if she could talk. We stood by the coffee machine, two people performing normalcy. I'm glad you're back, she said. I looked at her, waiting. She swallowed. This could have gone differently. It was the closest she could come to admitting they tried to bury me. I know, I said. She nodded slowly, then added, just be careful. You're on people's radar now. That was meant to scare me. It didn't. Because the only radar that mattered now was the board's. 2 weeks later, the recognition payment hit payroll. People acted like they weren't relieved, like they hadn't needed it, like they hadn't been wronged. But the office felt lighter, quieter, less performative. Then the final piece arrived in an all-hands update the CEO didn't host. It was hosted by the board liaison and internal audit. No names, no scandal language. Just an announcement. Compensation governance changes adopted. Manual overrides restricted. Approval thresholds revised. Access permissions audited and reduced. A leadership transition in strategic initiatives. Strategic initiatives. That was her. They didn't say she was punished. They said the structure was improved. But everyone understood what it meant. The company drew a line, even for her. That evening, I went to my car the same way I did when I got placed on leave. Slow, tired, not sure what emotion fit. I sat behind the wheel and didn't start the engine. And in that quiet, I finally understood what this had been about. Not revenge, not heroism. Just one decision, refusing to pretend the trail didn't matter. They had tried to make me feel small, so the lie could stay big. Instead, the lie had to shrink until it fit inside policy. I drove home without music. For the first time in weeks, my chest didn't feel tight. It felt calm. And the next morning, when I walked back into that building, nobody looked at me like a problem. They looked away, which, in a place like that, is how you know the truth won.